Central Asia is not a region that stimulates significant conversation in the modern West. The dominance of medieval house lords on the steppe, the centers of learning and culture in places like Samarkand and Herat, and even the existence of brilliant cities like Merv have since been largely forgotten in a Europeanized world. Instead, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan are better known for their positions in the Russosphere and not for their own histories. As the age of modernity approached, these traditionally prosperous societies faced the might of Russia's mechanized army. Just like everywhere else in the Islamic world, the Central Asian Khanates found out the hard way how far they were behind the might of Europe. So, join me as I inquire how these great nations became part of the Russian sphere of influence in the first place. Was it possible that they could have avoided subjugation? And most importantly, how is it that a diverse region once filled with warriors, artists, and scientists can now be lumped into an area termed as the Soviet stands? Central Asia has been largely shaped by many different cultural influences, primarily of Turkic, Iranian, Arab, and Mongolian peoples. The people of Turan, as it had been called by other Iranian language speakers for over 2,000 years, struck fear among settled peoples for their brutal and efficient raids through their unmatched use of mounted archery. Horsemanship remained essential to controlling Central Asia well into the modern period. After the conquest of the Mongol Empire and its breakaway states, all-powerful nomadic polities in Central Asia claimed their legitimacy through relation to Genghis Khan. Their power would stagnate, however, especially in relation to the meteoric rise of the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent commercial and gunpowder revolutions in the Christian kingdoms of Europe. European Christians in particular would very soon begin to advance on the same Central Asians who had once subjugated them. In 1480, the Russian prince Ivan III cast out the Golden Horde, an offshoot of the Great Mongol Empire, and subsequently won de facto independence for Moscow. His grandson, the first Tsar Ivan the Terrible, moved to conquer the horse lords. In 1552, he decisively conquered the Khanate of Kazan. Over 100 years of war between the two states had hitherto been insufficient to determine a winner. This made the subjugation of Kazan an understandably notable moment for contemporary geopolitics. Unimpressed, however, was Devlet Gerai I. As the Khan of Crimea since 1551, he had confronted the Russians before. The Khanate of Kazan had previously been under Crimea's sphere of influence before the Russian conquest. In 1556, the Russians conquered the Astrakhan Khanate, another traditional ally of Crimea. The dynamic between the Russian Tsardom and the Central Asian nomads had already fundamentally shifted at this time. Not only did the Europeans clearly have momentum in the battle to control the steppe, Devlet found himself struggling to balance relations with his Ottoman guarantors and allocating resources to repel incursions from his new Cossack neighbors. After years of raids on Russian territory and failed attempts to take Moscow, finally there was a breakthrough. The Crimean Khanate sacked Moscow in 1571. Drawing on support from several Russian boyars who had defected, the nomads were able to enter the city with relative ease and destroyed the city completely. For a moment, it seemed as though Devlet would totally subdue Ivan and slam shut Russian entry into Central Asia before it could really begin. Instead, a series of miscalculations on the part of Devlet Gerai culminated with a Russian force decisively expelling the Khanate's forces from the region in 1572 at the Battle of Molodi. Though the Crimean Khanate may technically have not been located within Central Asia, it had the pedigree of the esteemed Central Asian horse lords. Regardless, it had become clear that significant advantages in firepower and fortifications rendered any antiquated notion of the invincible horse archer moot. For the first time, the Russians had unequivocal control of the entire Volga River, and the rest of Central Asia would soon follow suit. Over the next century, Russia was too busy with its time of troubles, a period that was shaped by domestic upheavals and foreign invasions. But that was decisively ended by Peter the Great, who set Russia on an aggressive course of conquest. In the heart of Asia, in the modern-day northern half of Xinjiang, lay the Zunga Khanate. Unbeknownst to its aging Khan, Sevag Raptan's realm would soon draw the attention of the Russian military machine. But he was unmoved by the fortresses Russians were constructing within the northern reach of his territory. The Russian threat did not loom nearly as large as that of the Chinese Qing Empire, with whom the Zungas had already been warring for a decade before he began the first of his 30 years as Khan. The Russian Tsar, Peter, would learn the difficulty of conquest in 1716. Deep within unfriendly territory, the commanding Russian officer had already taken shelter at a nearby fortress. Intending to alert the Tsar that he had inefficient manpower to engage the Zungar military, his message could not be delivered before Sevag Raptan laid siege to the fort, which fell after 2 months. This would not be the last of the Russian failures in Central Asia. Alexander Bekovich Cherkasy, who was originally born a Muslim prince of Circassian origin, was tasked by Peter to survey the Caspian region in 1717, ensuring the loyalty of the Khanate of Khiva along the way. The Khivan Khan, Sher Ghazi, did not shy away from using force during his reign, harassing new arrivals in the lower delta of the Amudarya and crushing a slave rebellion. Bekovich Cherkasy, ignorant of Sher Ghazi Khan's brutality, was slaughtered along with his men after the Khan feigned surrender to separate the Russian troops. All officers were executed, and any other captured Russian survivors were sold into slavery. The loss of a substantial number of his troops did not particularly concern Peter. At the moment, he had not yet ensured victory in the Great Northern War, and hostilities between Russia and the Ottoman Empire were increasing rapidly. Russian attempts at conquering Central Asia had to be postponed for the time being. Unfortunately for the Khans of Central Asia, they could not forever go like for like in a brutal conflict against the Russian Empire. This was becoming increasingly apparent to some Central Asian Khans. Abul Khair Khan, leader of the Junior Juz or division of the Kazakhs, laid the groundwork for potential Kazakh resistance against Russia in the future, though perhaps unknowingly. He galvanized the de facto independent middle and senior Juz into a unified force under his command in his conflicts against Sevag Raptan's Zunga Khanate. The united sentiment fizzled out, unfortunately for Abul Khair, but it would make significant comebacks in the coming years. Abul Khair also saw the importance in maintaining friendly relations with the Russians when possible, even swearing an oath of submission to the Russian Empire in 1731. This led to some confusion. The Russians interpreted this as the Khan accepting Russian suzerainty. The Khan interpreted this as a mutually beneficial alliance that only nominally had the Russians as senior partners. However, upon the realization of the misunderstanding, the Russian policy towards the Kazakhs actually stayed the same. To the Russians, access to trade further east and safety from devastating Kazakh raids were well worth sacrificing more formal control over nomadic subjects. Ablay Khan, leader of the Middle Juz since the early mid-18th century, was made Khan of all the Kazakhs in 1771. His reign saw the zenith of the Kazakh Khanate and was immediately followed by its downfall. Ablay Khan was a savant at playing powers against each other. He courted alliances with the Russian and Qing empires very meticulously and eventually received the support of both states against his own Kazakh rivals. His diplomatic cunning even made him a symbol of Kazakh patriotism today. Nevertheless, peace and stable relations with Russia and the Qing came at the cost of a vicious internal strife within the Khanate. Ablay Khan was a powerful and respected ruler among virtually all of his Kazakh subjects, but his sons did not remotely command the same respect. Upon his death in 1781, his sons squabbled among themselves for power. By the time Khanzada Wazi Sultan could succeed his father, he had already lost control of the junior and senior Juz to the Russian Empire. By 1822, the Kazakh lands were firmly under Russian control. Emperor Alexander I formally abolished the Khanate of the Middle Juz 4 years prior, stripping the traditional Kazakh elite of even nominal influence. Furthermore, there were now concrete attempts to colonize the Kazakh way of thinking. Alexander issued reforms intending to pressure the Kazakhs into abandoning their nomadic ways. Though these largely failed, encroaching Russian settlers and merchants continued to block Kazakh horsemen from grazing grounds, often leading to bloodshed. The most protracted of the Kazakh rebellions, and perhaps most significant, was Kenesari's rebellion. Kenesari, grandson of the revered Ablay Khan, began raiding Russian caravans in 1837. Hoping to reform an independent Kazakh Khanate, he collected victories and supporters, and even established himself as Khan of the Kazakhs in 1841. He had succeeded, if only briefly. The Russians eventually organized themselves and concentrated on Kenesari, who was now hopelessly outgunned. Forced to flee, he died in battle against Kyrgyz tribesmen, themselves seeking protection from Russia. Any chance of his rebellion succeeding died with him. The hibernating Russian bear had now awoken, and none of the Central Asian tribes were safe. The Kyrgyz killers of Kenesari, for their part, had already mulled over their own best methods to exercise agency. A Kurultai among Kyrgyz tribesmen was called in 1842 to determine the best way to counter the encroaching Russians and Kazakhs. They decided on unity. Urmun Niyazbekulu was named the first Khan of the Kara-Kyrgyz Khanate. Urmun Khan proved to be a shrewd diplomat and a commanding leader. He very quickly centralized power in the Khanate, uniting the Kyrgyz against external threats. When Kenesari launched his invasion into Kyrgyz land, Urmun Khan asked for Russian aid. His request was denied, but even this he used to his advantage. Defeating the Kazakhs in battle through clever usage of terrain, he captured Kenesari and executed him. Then he sent the final Kazakh Khan's head to the Russians as a macabre peace offering demonstrating aligned interests. So impressed was Emperor Nicholas I that he bestowed upon the Kyrgyz leaders gold medals and gold-embroidered robes. Urmun Khan, in particular, was made a podpolkovnik, or lieutenant colonel of the Russian Empire. He now had Russian legitimacy. The Kyrgyz wielded great power under Urmun Khan, but the Khanate was only held together by him, and he was not without rivals. Urmun Khan was defeated and captured by Bugu tribesmen in 1854. The Bugu chieftain, whose son was married to Urmun Khan's daughter, wanted only to ransom him in exchange for a guarantee that he would not be invaded again. Instead, a Bugu rival of Urmun Khan personally speared him and left him to bleed out in his daughter's arms. Retributive attacks by Urmun Khan's sons would spell defeat for the Bugu tribe, but it was too late for the Kara-Kyrgyz. Urmun Khan was dead, and his son, even with great effort, would never have been able to maintain unity. In 1867, 13 years after the death of his father, Omitalay Urmun submitted to Russian authority. The death of Urmun Khan and the fall of his Kara-Kyrgyz Khanate would prove to be the point in which the Russian conquest became inevitable. Multiple Central Asian polities that had held out for decades crumbled entirely in 1868. The first was the Khanate of Kokand. Even prior to Omitali Urmun's formal surrender, Kokand's grasp on independence was tenuous. The Russians had captured Tashkent in 1865, killing the Khanate's de facto leader in the struggle. Tashkent, then the wealthiest city in Central Asia, was the primary source of Kokand's power and revenue. With control of Tashkent ceded, the Khanate's only real lifeline was their ally and neighbor, the yet unconquered Emirate of Bukhara. However, any Bukharan forces sent in relief were smashed by the Russian soldiers. Unmolested, the Russian army conquered the city of Khojand in 1866, thus cutting off Kokand from Bukhara entirely. Bukhara did not long outlast Kokand. For many years the emirate was led by Nasrullah Khan. Emir Nasrullah was unafraid to make threatening overtures to European powers. In fact, he ordered the beheadings of two British envoys, Arthur Connolly and Charles Stoddart, in 1842. He also introduced sweeping reforms to Bukharan society, including in military modernization. The effectiveness of his reforms is debated, but his reputation as a leader far outclasses his successors. When Nasrullah Khan died in 1860, his son Muzaffar became Emir. The reformed Bukharan military under Emir Muzaffar were little obstacle to the Russian forces. Commanding the Bukharans himself, Emir Muzaffar was defeated at the Battle of Zarabulak on June 14, 1868, and his army was destroyed. 4 days later, the Russians successfully captured the crucial city of Samarkand, forcing swift negotiations from Emir Muzaffar. In only 6 months, 2/3 of the infamous Uzbek states had fallen. The final Uzbek state, the Khanate of Khiva, had historically proven to be especially challenging for would-be Russian conquerors. Aside from Bekovich-Cherkasy's disastrous 1717 campaign, an attempt in 1839 at installing a Russophile Khan was also unsuccessful. In 1873, however, the circumstances could not be more different. The Khanate's capital fell in June after a 3-month campaign in which Russian officers were more concerned about their personal rivals than the enemy Khivans. Muhammad Rahim II, the Khan of Khiva, fled during the Russian advance to seek refuge among his Umut allies. Upon the Russian capture of Khiva, the Khan reluctantly returned to his territory to enter negotiations. He agreed to end the Khivan slave trade and bequeath all military and foreign relation decisions to the Tsar. Muhammad Rahim II, a renowned patron of the arts, thus signed away the independence of the Khanate of Khiva. Perhaps it was fitting, the first target of Russian aggression that offered the fiercest resistance fell quietly and unceremoniously, with the stroke of a poet's pen. Scattered resistance continued to annoy the Russians, however. On and off, uprisings lasted into the Soviet era. A rebellion intended to reassert the Khanate of Kokand as independent was crushed in 1876. The failed revolt prompted the Russian Empire to formally disestablish the Khanate, much to the chagrin of the wealthy figurehead Muhammad Khudayar. All that was left of the independent Central Asian polities were the divided Turkmen tribes. To their credit, the Turkmens showed furious resistance. A Russian campaign in 1879 culminated with the humiliating Russian retreat at the First Battle of Göktepe. But this did not change the bleak reality. The Russian conquest was by now unquestionably inevitable. In fact, the Russians were so confident of eventual victory that their presiding commander was publicly maligned for unnecessarily slaughtering the Turkmen defenders just as much as he was for his gross waste of resources. Indeed, the final Turkmen stronghold surrendered in January of 1881 at the Second Battle of Göktepe. Over 150 years after Peter the Great's failed attempt at conquering the Zungars, Central Asia was united under a European banner. In 2025, Central Asia is not as globally known for its past glories as it perhaps should be. Nonetheless, the peoples of Central Asia have not forgotten. Russian influence in the region is obviously prevalent, but each of the Central Asian nations retain their own language. The spiritual successors of the region's Khanates are still devout Muslims. They view their ancestors who resisted Russian imperialism not as pitiable and oppressed, but as national heroes to be celebrated. And nomadism still maintains a role in Central Asian societies, even making a resurgence in certain places. After nearly 200 years, the Russian Empire did indeed conquer Central Asia. But over 100 years after the death of the final Russian Tsar, the Central Asians have not left.
Thank you guys for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace!